Hello and good time zone, everybody. Welcome to Horde of Tales, to another edition of our Creators Talk. My name is Markus, known as the Individual, and I am here today with Trekiros, someone who hardly bears any introduction, but I still want to give him the chance to quickly introduce himself. Trekiros, introduce yourself.
So hi, I'm Trek. I'm a French creator, I suppose, because I make a bunch of different things. So it's kind of hard to describe. I've published some books on DM's Guild. I make some YouTube videos. And apparently I also make some websites nowadays.
You make a lot of stuff, and you make a lot of D&D 5th edition related stuff.
Yep. Especially D&D 5th edition. I am making my own system, but it's way too early to actually show to anybody who isn't like at my table, so I can smooth out the edges as we go.
Interesting. I'm going to keep that in mind for maybe a little bit later in the conversation today. But Trekiros, you have been involved in a few very interesting DM's Guild products. You run a YouTube channel, Trekiros Game Changers, with videos that give very handy advice to people running games like Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition on how to, for example, use things from video games in your own games. But one does not wake up one morning and be like, I'm going to be a 5th edition content creator. How did you get into tabletop RPGs, Dungeons and Dragons, and into writing your own content for the game?
Right. Yeah, definitely not something I planned on doing originally. I'm, like many people, I assume, a Critical Role baby. I started playing in 2018, so pretty late in D&D's life. But that means there's a lot of things that I did before I got into D&D. In a sense, like game design is not something I kind of picked up. It's always been something that I was into from a very young age. I kind of blame Lego as a gateway drug of sorts, of things that try to make you more creative as an individual. And yeah, I kind of toyed with game design my whole life. I made a couple of games as a hobby that never went anywhere because I wanted to study software and that paid a lot more. But eventually, so when I got into D&D, I figured the easiest way I can find to become a better GM for my players would be to make a bunch of terrible homebrew and put it on the internet for everyone to absolutely tear apart so that they would kind of teach me accidentally what makes this game tick. And so that's what I did for a couple of years.
That's interesting. You say, like, well, I made homebrew, I put it on the internet for other people to also pick apart. How do you, when you made your first homebrew and you started sharing it online, what was your initial experience in sharing something that you created and sharing it with an audience online?
I mean, it went about how I expected it to, which is people absolutely destroyed it. I think my first homebrew was a poisoner rogue. So I looked at the poisons in the Dungeon Master's Guide and I went, this is not great. So I kind of put together a whole crafting system which was overcomplicated and made a bunch of assumptions about how you would run your game, which people were very right to tear apart. And I'm very happy to report that I'm not using this at my table anymore. But yeah, by doing that, like, people taught me, okay, so this is how 5e works. This is how D&D works. These are the design principles that you should go after, like player expression being so important to a D&D player. Things like, oh, maybe don't make a system overcomplicated because not everybody has computers when they play.
Not everyone wants to pull up a Google spreadsheet when they're running something at the table.
Which is their mistake. I mean, spreadsheets are life. But
let's agree on that. Spreadsheets for life. That's important. But it's interesting what you say there, that from the feedback that you got, and I can imagine that the tone of that feedback was all the way from some people maybe remaining polite and others going, "But why did you put this here? How dare you like this?" But nonetheless, from what you say, it did help you learn about the game, but also designing for the game.
Yep. Kind of accidentally, but yes. People were, different levels of polite about it, but like that's kind of to be expected when it comes to game design. Like, giving feedback is a job. Like, you pay someone to do a design consultation normally, and the reason you pay someone is that they're very good at it. So if you go online to some Discord channel or something and you ask for feedback and you get feedback for free, it's not going to be filtered. You're going to have the skill to interpret it yourself. And it's sometimes sifting through a lot of things that you either disagree with, or at least disagree with the way it's phrased. But like, to me, that's part of the job. That's just part of the process. It's something I got into D&D expecting, so I was okay with receiving that.
But no matter the feedback that you got, you did stick with designing for the game, and you did continue making your own homebrews, putting it online. Was there a certain moment, was there a certain bit of homebrew that you shared and that you saw other people using as well, and that made you go like, I'm designing something that other people can use?
I never really got that moment until Home Field Advantage, I would say. But because I never had like a huge success on Reddit or whatever, the way other creators might have. It was just me and 20 upvotes, and people were like, "This looks cool," and that's pretty much it. After a couple of years of doing this, I kind of stumbled upon by accident a creator named Andrew Welker, who was taking applications for a project called Tasha's Crucible of Everything Else on the DM's Guild. And at that point, I had a couple subclasses that I had been working on for a couple of months just in my spare time. And I was like, I'm curious how books are made. I'm just going to apply those subclasses and see how it goes from the inside. Without really like having any plans beyond that. I was just curious how books are made, like what's an editor.
And how did that experience go when you applied those things, when you're like, sure, I want to see if I can get into Tasha's Crucible of Everything Else? How did that go?
There was some ups and downs, I'll say this much. Like on DM's Guild, the way it's set up, it's very much a website for hobbyists. So you don't get the kind of professionalism necessarily that you might get in a third-party publisher like MCDM or whatever.
Right.
So it was definitely interesting, and I definitely learned a lot. But it was just kind of a nice little side project while I was working on other stuff.
And I can imagine that the experience that still was useful experience for you to gather being involved in such a process.
Yeah, because then about a year later is when I got the idea for home field advantage, and at that point I was like, I know how to make this happen, and I can't believe nobody else has made it happen yet. So I'll just take the plunge.
And a plunge it certainly was. And you're giving a nice segue over here because you mentioned home field advantage a little bit earlier. And home field advantage, Mithril bestseller on DM's Guild, ENnie-award winning product. And that's what you started to put together at that point. What did for you spark the idea for home field advantage? Did you flip through the monster manual and see like how many monsters didn't have any layer actions? Do you just like putting things in at initiative 20 in the initiative order? Or was there something else that sparked that idea?
I mean, like a lot of DMs, I assume, I just add layer actions to a bunch of monsters anyway. I just like spicing up my encounters, making them a bit more interesting, because if you look at the monsters in the monster manual, most of them are like, here's how many hit points, and there's 2 claws and a bite. Enjoy. I hope you can make it interesting, because I'm not going to do it for you.
The two claws and a bite is just too relatable. It's a meme, a trope for a reason in the monster design of 5e.
Yeah, I ran some stats, and I think like over 100 monsters or something had basically just that as their entire stat block. Mm-hmm. It was not pretty.
And as you mentioned, there's a lot of monsters that should have layer actions, but didn't have them by default. And there's probably a lot of DMs already who created their own layer actions for these kind of monsters. But you decided to create an entire book filled with them.
Yeah, so I would not have to just improvise them as I had been for the past 3 years at that point. I kind of just, I guess, like one of the most common pieces of advice you get in business in general is make the stuff you would want to buy. And I wanted to buy this book and it didn't exist. So I made it.
That is some good and timeless business advice. Make the stuff you would want to buy.
Yeah.
And when you then started to make the book, and you say you didn't want to homebrew those layer actions anymore, but you liked using layer actions. What is it exactly about layer actions in 5e that you like about them? What makes them cool?
What makes them cool is, I would say, the fact that there's not a lot of mechanics outside of this one in 5e which tie the monster to the terrain. And like this is, at least on my table, I don't really do theater of the mind. I do battle maps, and I try to make the tactics a bit interesting for my players. So layer actions are just such an easy way to do that. I don't need to think too much about the kind of stuff I talk about on my YouTube channel about difficult terrain and elevation changes or whatever. I could just, here's initiative 20. There's a big cloud and nobody sees inside. What are you going to do about it?
Because it's also, with layer actions, because they're also present on the initiative list, it's also something that for players immediately signals something like we're in a big fight here because the terrain itself has a turn in the initiative.
And I guess that's kind of why Wizard of the Coast only restricted layer actions to legendary monsters in official books. Like if you there's like 3 monsters below CR 10, I think, who get layer actions in official sources. There's the Merengon, I think his name is, the one which is like the boatman of the Styx.
Right.
And then one that people don't necessarily know about is that in Voldo's Guide to Monsters, hags get layer actions if they're in a coven. Yeah,
Ooh.
I didn't know either.
Yeah, I think it's in a sidebar of the hags, that if they're in a coven of 3, then they get layer actions.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of it.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, though. Like, we don't just run bosses in tier 3 and tier 4. We run bosses at every level of play, so might as well give everyone their actions, you know? Anyone who
Right, because for the level 2 party, the fight with the bugbear chieftain or something, that's also a boss fight, right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, the bugbear chieftain has an encampment that they have designed, they have built, so it makes sense that they would have built some defenses into it. And their actions are just kind of a good way to represent those defenses mechanically.
Yeah, yeah. With the layer action, as you say, like there's boss fights are even there before tier 3. Lower level parties also have boss fights. It does indeed make sense to create more layer actions for monsters all across the level spectrum. But I can imagine that if we're looking at monster design, factoring things in like challenge rating and the likes, adding layer actions has also an impact on the challenge rating of monsters. Was that something when writing for Home Field Advantage and designing these layer actions? How big was the impact of that on the monster balance on adding layer actions to them?
So challenge rating, I have a whole video on the subject. It's kind of a weird thing.
Exactly.
But layer actions are one of the few things where it's actually pretty consistent in that when a monster is in its lair, its challenge rating increases by 1. And the way the math of the challenge rating is set up, an increase of 1 challenge rating is almost always like 6 to 15 hit points and then plus 3 damage or something. So it's very consistent in this way. Like if you do the math, if you crunch the numbers, increasing a monster's challenge rating by 1 is a very, very predictable mathematical operation. So I was able to tell the team, because like I didn't make this whole book by myself. I only wrote like 30 pages or so, and then did most the project management and stuff. So I was able to tell the team, okay, here's the target numbers that you should hit. Please don't give me layer actions that are like a super mega laser. Because that's going to throw things a bit out of whack.
Instead of making the super mega laser, just go for the laser. Let's keep the super mega laser for another time.
That's going to be a different book.
It's going to be a Home Field Advantage 2 Electric Boogaloo when we just throw balance out of the window.
Layer actions just increase your CR by 10 now.
That bugbear chieftain really had it coming, or the party had it coming when they started fighting that bugbear. That's interesting. So you gave also to the team the guideline, like, hey, as long as you stick within these numbers, leading to increasing the CR of the creature just by 1, they have the design space within the limitations of those numbers to design their layer actions.
Yep. And I made sure they would make full use of that design space. Like, we experimented a bunch with stuff like, for example, there's the Etin, who's the two-headed giant who constantly bickers with itself.
Right.
And for example, that one, we made it so it has to randomly select which layer action it uses to represent the fact that it's bickering. So there's a bunch of weird stuff like this. There's goblins, like goblins are chaotic and stuff. So when the goblin boss gets killed, a new goblin is selected to be the new goblin boss, and that's the one who gets to make layer actions now.
That really utilizes the flavor of the monster as well.
Yeah, it's such an untapped gold mine that we were like kids at a birthday party, like, oh, there's so much we could do.
I can imagine that, like, if sitting together with the team writing and coming up with these ideas must have been a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, absolutely. this is a project that we kind of approached as hobbyists from the start. I tried to put like zero expectations on the team. They were free to leave the project at any time for any reason. It wouldn't put the project in jeopardy or whatever. So I was like, go have fun. This is going to be so much fun for me. I'm just sharing it with others, because if I had to write 250 sets of layer actions, it would take me 5 years.
Great also to hear that you approached it with the team from such a free angle, like giving them the freedom, trying to keep the pressure as low as possible, and just letting them have fun in designing. That sounds like that's also important in the design process.
Yeah, and it's something that's kind of only possible on DM's Guild in a way, because like nowadays I'm working on a setting book for Kickstarter, and so the approach is completely different, because now I'm not just hiring a bunch of hobbyists and having fun with them. I'm hiring freelancers, and we have contracts and all of that stuff.
Right.
It's a lot more responsibility, but that also means the scope of the book has to be fixed in place. I don't get to like, hey, let's add 40 pages that I had not planned, because if I add 40 pages, I'm gonna have to pay for 40 pages worth of art and layout and editing, and that's going to throw things out of whack.
Yeah. I mean, which is totally important. If you have people working to add those 40 pages, they should of course be paid for that as well.
Yeah.
But it makes it all the more important that you scope everything out correctly when you already start the project.
Yeah, for Kickstarter, that's really important. For DM's Guild, the way it works is most projects on DM's Guild, you have a royalty split. English is not my first language, if that was not
no worries
obvious by now. Yeah, you have royalty split, so you can kind of split by how much each member of the team has contributed, which is what we do generally. Whereas on Kickstarter, people get paid per word. So there's this weird dynamic where, as the project lead, you kind of have to tell people, please don't write more than 2,000 words, because I'm not going to have the money if you write a 20,000 word essay.
That's a completely different dimension to project management, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Circling a bit back to home field advantage and all the different layer actions you got in there. Full disclosure, I am myself a big fan of home field advantage. Since it came out, I have been using it in my own D&D games from time to time. And I'm also a big fan of layer actions. And I'm going to be honest, I'm a fan of layer actions because I can put a mysterious layer label on the initiative order, and people will only find out after the first round what that is. What is in that book? What is personally your favorite layer action in there? And I know this is hard because it's a book of that you were involved in and a lot of people who wrote those layer actions, but
which
if you
is
had
my
to pick
favorite
one,
baby?
Which is your favorite baby?
So there's one that I really like, which is the Frost Giant, where one of the layer actions is it just storms the ground and nothing happens. And then a round later, there's an avalanche. And everything gets buried in like 10 feet of snow. And it's just something you really couldn't get outside of layer actions. It's epic in the best possible way. Like it's something you would expect to see in a AAA movie. It just delivers on the aesthetic of the Frost Giant so well.
Right. And it's also the kind of mechanic where you can already kind of telegraph something in one round, kind of already, well, have that warning shot that something is going to happen and give the players a full round to do something before that disaster hits the battle.
Yeah. If you've played like some computer RPGs, like this kind of hey, here's a big red circle. Do you want to stay in it?
And that's something that makes combat more interactive. Some people might say, oh, that's very video gamey for my tabletop RPG. But on the other hand, it does trigger players at the table to also take other factors into consideration. They're not just thinking about, oh, on my next turn, I'm going to cast a spiritual weapon, and then I'm going to move over there. No, now they also need to pay attention to what's happening in the lair they're in.
Yeah. There's this huge stigma against video games in the tabletop RPG community, I guess because of 4E. But I'm a little baby in this community. I've only been here for 5 years, which is actually quite a lot. I'm used to this, and I'm okay with this. And I think 4E has very good reasons why people don't like it. But at the same time, having this stigma, I think, in a way, it kind of keeps people in the past. It keeps people doing things the way they have been done for the past 30 years. Like, Dungeons and Dragons has inspired entire generations of game designers. And it's kind of a shame that it's not really taking anything back from those people it has brought up, you know?
Right.
Like, it's kind of, I guess, the entire premise of my YouTube channel, in a sense. So, of course, I'm a bit biased about this, but...
Which is a good point to speak of, because you do have on your YouTube channel a lot of videos that look at things that you can also take from video games as idea. You have, for example, a video about map design, how, for example, video games design certain maps and gaming areas, how your map design influences the movement of characters through the map, where you can have choke points, for example, how you can have people loop through a map and the likes. And all of that and more are principles from something like video games that can really enhance the gameplay for people at the table. Is that something that you also actively use in the games that you run?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. As much as I think of them anyway, because I'm only human. I don't do more than a couple of hours of prep per week, because otherwise I'm gonna go crazy. but yeah, it's kind of, I grew up on playing games that had this standard, I would say, of level design, and so it kind of makes sense to me that I look at my map, and if it's an empty square, I feel like there's something missing.
If there's just player characters on one side, the monsters on the other, and you just know they're just going to spend their first turn just moving to each other, something is wrong with the map.
Something went wrong somewhere.
And that means that you have to design your maps more interactive, or at least to give strategical opportunities. And we already mentioned earlier in this conversation that things like elevation, line of sight, and all of that stuff makes sense. Is there, when you design your own maps for combat in D&D, once you've also added layer actions in there, for example, are there any favorite or fun things you like to put on encounter maps that make the encounter more fun, for like add a challenge for the players, but also makes it fun for the players to be in that fight?
I would say the number one thing would be destructible walls. Like, we have this idea, especially like in video games, they just don't have the technology to do destructible terrain very well. So the moment you give a player the option to destroy a wall, they will take it every single time. It's magical.
So the moment you tell them, like, hey, this wall looks
a bit flimsy.
Yeah. they just take the bait, and it's just a matter of time before they take it down.
Oh yeah.
I can see the appeal of that, especially when it opens up new ways of approaching whatever you're fighting. If it can give you a way to, for example, move around the enemy, then that makes it extra fun.
Or sometimes they just like, I had this arcane archer at my table who would sometimes just poke a little hole so he could snipe through, but then people wouldn't really know where the bullets were raining from. And it was glorious every time.
But do you also have the monsters or the enemies use those kinds of tricks against the party?
Oh yeah. Well, if it's fair game, it's fair game.
Right.
There's a point after which, like, people talk about the Wang Rod situation for players, which is, you know, like, okay, I'm acting this way because that's what my character would do. Okay, but why did you design your character this way? And for DMs, the corollary of that would be, I designed my bad guy like this, so of course he would do this because that's what it can do. But then why did you design your bad guy like this? Why did you design your bad guy in a way that what it can do makes the game less fun?
And that's the thing, right? I mean, you can design a bad guy that does something that is bad for the players, but can still be fun for the players. But you can also design a bad guy that does something bad, and it's just not really fun for the players when the bad guy does that.
Oh, the bad guy can cast Dimension Door with subtle spell. Try it. See if that works well at your table.
I have my suspicions about the results from that. Yeah. There is, however, also something that bad guys in D&D have that players and player characters, unless they have one of the dragon masks from Rise of Tiamat, usually don't have. And that's legendary resistances. And legendary resistances, Trekiros, I think that's a topic you love talking about.
Because I've talked about it for minutes.
And I think it's no coincidence that there is also on your YouTube channel a video dedicated to legendary resistances and your opinions on it. What do you think about legendary resistances?
I think they're a very misguided way to solve a problem that is largely self-inflicted.
That's interesting. So they try to solve something. You mentioned you try to solve something that is self-inflicted by the rules. What is that exactly in this case?
So, you know how when you start the game, you get spells like Charm Person?
Yeah.
And then the game levels you up, so it has to give you some shinier toys like Hold Person. And then it immediately regrets it because it tries to simultaneously give you Hold Monster and then give you single boss monsters. And those two things are not very compatible.
Exactly, because we all know the scenario where, as the DM, you put that single boss monster down the BBEG of your campaign. They have their epic monologue, and the moment initiative is rolled, they roll terrible. One of the players whips out Hold Monster or Banish or something like that. And that was your big bad encounter with the bad guy. And
you foreshadow a battle for 20 sessions, and then the monk just goes, I go Stunning Strike 4 times in a single round.
Exactly. And that is where legendary resistances, as they are in the rules, the idea is, of course, that they give single monster fights a way of resisting those things, a way of basically saying, no, I ignore this Stunning Strike. Oh, no, I'm not banished right now. And we all know that how they're written. Usually these monsters, they have 3 of them. They can spend them to decide to succeed on a saving throw against something. But that is, in itself, maybe not the most interesting way of doing it. Right?
It's kind of... It would work in a computer game, ironically enough, because in a computer game, you're playing every single character in the party. So even if one character loses a round, you're fine. You still have 4 dudes who can do things. But in D&D, if your turn is wasted, you'll kind of have to wait for 10 minutes to half an hour, depending on how fast the other players at your table are.
Exactly.
And that's not the greatest experience.
Yeah, you're that poor player who had their PC roll pretty low in the initiative. You've been waiting all around to try banishment on the boss, and then the DM just says, well, he failed, but he decides to succeed because of legendary resistances.
Yep. But if you get a DM who's a master narrator, you might get something a bit fancier, like, oh, he shrugs it off, or some nonsense like that. But most of the time, it's just he decides to succeed.
Exactly. And from what I get, and please correct me if I understand this wrong, the feeling that that also gives is not only as a player do you feel like the turn that you spent was a turn that didn't have any impact, but also the only resource that the monster has expended for this was a resource that was made for this. They didn't actually expend any other kind of resource.
Yeah. Like I've seen a bunch of fixes to this. I think there's this YouTuber who has kind of vanished off the face of the earth called A-Hero, who made a pretty popular video about how maybe a dragon could use its breath weapon as a resource to save against effects. Like, if at least you're progressing the fight in some other way that matters to other players at in your party,
right,
you're contributing. But if it's just a resource that exists only to squander you, the one idiot who decided to play a control caster, well, too bad.
And that's an important thing you mentioned, because the moment you feel like even your spell didn't work, or the cool thing that you wanted to do, the moment you feel that didn't work, but it did cost the monster something else to shrug it off, it still feels like you're advancing. And I think that's also at the core of the video that you made about legendary resistances. If you haven't seen it, people, if you're watching, you should definitely check it out on Trekiros' YouTube channel. And I don't want to give away too much, but you also in your video basically look at how can you make monster legendary resistances work differently. Did you try the things that you suggested? Are those also tried in practice in sessions?
This little supplement that's included in the video, like I think it has 20, I think, alternatives. There's something. Okay. Never mind. It's just in my garden.
Okay.
It has 20 alternatives to legendary resistances, but I've been sitting on that little thing for almost 2 years.
Oh, wow.
I didn't know what to do with it because it felt a waste to put it on DM's Guild, and then I don't get to use it on any other project ever. But also, like, that gave me 2 years to actually test every single one of those options at my players. My players are very familiar with those. The final boss of our campaign, it had the one where you gain a bonus. It's described as a crackling armor, and you get a bonus of like plus 20 to your saves, and every time you take 50 damage, the bonus is reduced by 1. So eventually, after you deal enough damage to the monster, you can stun it.
Oh.
But the whole idea of legendary resistances is maybe let's not end this super climactic encounter after 1 round.
You're right.
So just by doing that, you're already doing what legendary resistances are designed to do, just in a way that doesn't make one of your players feel like their character doesn't matter.
Exactly. Not giving the feeling that you just wasted a turn and a spell slot, for example, on something that didn't matter in the fight.
Yeah.
the thing you mentioned, that legendary resistances try to solve the problem of not having the monster die, be banished, or something within the first round. This is of course a very important thing to fix, because D&D in its nature, usually outside of things like legendary actions, lair actions, legendary resistances, if you put a single monster against a party of 4 to 6 PCs, of course the single monster is always going to bite the dust. You can probably increase the CR of that single monster by 3 or 4 even, but in most cases, the party is going to win by the nature of having the action economy advantage in the game. Are you familiar with what Matt Colville and MCDM, for example, do with action-oriented monsters?
Yeah, that video was already out by the time we made Home Field Advantage, so it was definitely one of the inspirations for that book.
Do you think that both of these things, the home field advantage, like the layer actions, but also changing up legendary resistances and action-oriented monsters, do you think they're kind of different approaches of solving a similar challenge?
In a sense, yeah, it's all solving the issue of 2 bites and a claw, 2 claws and a bite.
Right. You're right.
Making monsters which will actually get players to act differently from monster to monster.
Right.
And that's probably something I'll talk about in a video, but in game design, that's called orthogonal monster design. There's some really great videos about this on XCOM 2. I think Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit has made a great video about this, where basically like every single monster in XCOM 2 has the kind of abilities that need to be played around, and you need to kind of learn how to play around one of those monsters. So just by changing the composition of the enemy team, like if you have a Viper who can pull your monsters out of cover, and then you have a Berserker who is really good at dealing damage in melee, like that, you're going to approach that situation very differently than if you had a bunch of snipers in the enemy team.
Yeah.
And that's something that, was theorized in the time between when D&D decided that video games are bad and today.
And it's interesting, especially if we look at a game like XCOM, which if you look how combat is done in XCOM, which is basically you fight on a grid. It's it is a video game about how D&D combat works, basically. And that is some interesting stuff to extract from that game and apply to a tabletop RPG like D&D.
Yeah, it's kind of the stuff I would watch and try to like inform myself and just look into anyway, whether or not I was playing into D&D, because I'm just into that. But now I have an outlet where I get to actually try these things.
Coming back a little bit on the legendary resistances, you included with your video is your supplement with like a variety of about 20 different things of replacing legendary resistances. With those having been tested at the table, what was generally also the response of your players when they had to interact in a different way with legendary resistances? What changed in their approach?
So the funny thing about monster abilities is players tend to hate them. But I will say this much, they hated it in a way where they still had fun.
And that is kind of the balance you're looking for, right? Like you want them to go at the table, they're like, oh no, it's doing this again. But they should still say afterwards, oh great, this was annoying, but it was cool. Instead of seeing them go, yeah, well, that happened.
I guess I'm throwing an Eldritch Blast then.
Exactly. Yeah. Is there from those legendary resistance replacements and alternatives that you offer, if there's already 20 in there, I just take a wild guess that you probably have a few more ideas for legendary resistance alternatives that are not in that document?
I mean, those in the document are kind of everything I've tried, and then a couple that I haven't had the opportunity to try, but I've shown to my players, and they were like, "Oh, we are going to hate this."
Are there any, and it can be as vague or theoretical as possible, are there like any kind of replacements for legendary resistance that you would love to try and see how they work at the table?
So there's a book that was published on Kickstarter about a year and a half ago, I would say, which is called Emery's Log of Legendary Eminences or something. And it kind of does the same thing I do, which is give people alternatives to legendary resistances, but in a slightly different way, where instead of giving you a trait and then you get to put that trait on any monster that kind of fits the aesthetic of that trait, it starts from the monster. So you get one trait for adult green dragons, and then one trait for adult white dragons, and then one trait for etc., etc. So that's a different approach. But like, if I had infinite time, that would be so cool. Like, every single monster you have to tackle in a different way. And every single monster, like, by doing that, you get to tap into the specific lore of what an adult green dragon is. Like, it's mischievous. It's about poison, but not just about poison. It's also about sneaking and about swamps and all of that. Like, you could get so much more specific by tapping into the specific monster's lore. And like, I have 20 examples, but there's more than 1,000 monsters. So you can imagine how many possibilities you could tap into.
And there's also so many monsters that come with interesting lore that you would have a choice of different things that you could give them.
Yeah, like, clearly, if you take a look at some of them, you might go, oh, that's clearly designed for a hag. But you could also apply it to Nalfishni just as easily, because those are both kind of spooky, gory monsters. But the Nalfishni has so much lore that you could tap into that a hag doesn't really fit.
And I mean, if we're already talking about Nalfishni, I mean, also looking at other kinds of demons, for example, there is so much creative stuff you could do with them.
So much variety in there. Demons are my favorite.
Talk about that. I mean, you've spent a lot of time studying the monsters that are part of D&D, monsters that many of us have seen multiple times at the table, monsters that some of us have our favorites. What are some monsters that whenever you get the chance to throw them at your party, what's your go-to favorite monsters?
So I am like a lot of DMs in that I will avoid throwing the same monster multiple times at my players, because I like to give them a different experience every single time. With that said, there are many monsters who benefit from having a shield guardian. And I will use every opportunity to add one to an encounter, because it's just that example of orthogonal design. Like, you have to tackle the shield guardian first. Just by its presence in the encounter, you are adding a layer of tactical interestingness that wasn't there before.
Because you really have to get rid of that shield guardian first before you can deal with the actual threat.
Before you can deal with the actual threat, for the most part.
That's such a good combination. I'm imagining like having some kind of ranged or spellcasting enemy who just has a shield guardian as a buddy, and you have to get rid of that first.
It's really easy to justify. Anything that could potentially have magic items, which is a lot of boss monsters, is likely to have a shield guardian.
Yeah, and especially in like how magical most D&D settings are, shield guardians sound like really good bodyguards to have around. To just instead like, oh, no, I don't hire a bodyguard made out of meat and bones. I have a few shield guardians in my warehouse, and I take those with me when I go into dangerous places.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's cool. That's also, I have to say, a bit unexpected, because I think like when I ask people about like what's their favorite monster, I usually hear like, oh, it's mostly like the classic monsters from D&D. Like, oh, this is my favorite color of dragon, or Mind Flayer, or Beholder, or something. But Shield Guardian is actually a really good point. I have to use them more in my games.
It's definitely my favorite mechanically. If I had to pick a favorite, like in terms of aesthetic and lore, it's the Kuo-toa. Any day. Those little guys, they're so funny.
It's already like if you flip in the monster manual to their page and you see the artwork for the Kuo-toa, they have this piece of artwork where you see in Kuo-toa standing up with like a double thumbs up.
Yep.
And they look so excited, and then add in the lore that they basically can create new gods because they believe in them. It's fantastic.
It's such a good idea.
They are also criminally underutilized in adventures.
Yeah. I've added underwater dungeons to my campaigns for the sole purpose of throwing a bunch of Kuo-toa at my players. Not even as antagonists, just as very unreliable allies.
And that makes total sense. They don't have to be the bad guys. They're just like a little unreliable allies to have.
Yeah.
Super cool.
Cute little god creators.
Little god creators. Did you then ever combine Kuo-toas and Shield Guardians? Did our players ever meet a very wacky Kuo-toa who happened to have a Shield Guardian?
Oddly enough, not yet.
Well, future is unwritten. Exactly. I'm curious to hear how that will go.
Yeah,
all right.
On every single project that I've worked on, it was non-negotiable that I would work on Kuo-toa stuff. Like we've mentioned Tasha's Crucible of everything.
Yes.
I've statted out Blibdulpoop in that book.
Yeah.
And in the Home Field Advantage, I'm the one who wrote the lair actions for the Kuo-toa Priestess.
Yeah.
Archpriest. It's non-negotiable. If there's an opportunity to write about Kuo-toa, I will.
You will always uphold the status Kuo-toa. I understand. Yeah. Amazing. Trekiros, we're slowly making our way to the end of this conversation, but I like to ask hypothetical questions of the people who are so kind to come and talk with me here. Let's say, purely hypothetical, you wake up tomorrow morning and you have 7 missed calls from Wizards of the Coast. It's just on your phone. For some reason, you can see that Wizards of the Coast called you. And you call them back, and they tell you, Mr. Trekiros, thank you very much. Your ideas are great. We want you for D&D. And you can add any addition to the core rule system of D&D. What would you want to add to D&D as a part of its core rules?
Oh, God.
And you can only pick one. You can only pick one.
Oh, you're making this more difficult. I don't know if I would add so much as I would trim the fat.
Trim the fat?
Like, there's a lot of, again, because of legendary resistances and stuff, spells of 6th level or higher, I would question the need for their continued existence.
As in certain spells that are just up in that level and no one is using them anyway?
No, it's more like spells that are traps, in that a player is going to spend years yearning for those spells, wanting to get to the level where they get to use those spells. And then when they get to that level, because the game designers are so afraid of those spells that they just given you, they have to give their monsters magic resistance and plus 14 to every save, and then 3 legendary resistances just in case.
Right.
So your super cool spell that you've looked up to for years, it kind of never works.
And would you rather than have those spells removed so there's not the trap option of them anymore?
Maybe make them only available to monsters. I would be fine with that for the most part. Or give players more interesting versions of their existing spells rather than more powerful versions of their existing spells.
Exactly. Yeah. And give players then also the chance who have worked maybe in campaigns for years to get to those spell levels and really have those spells feel impactful and cool.
Yeah. And make sure the spells that, for example, if you have been using command for your entire game, make sure that spell continues working.
Right. Yeah. And not suddenly when you're at 15th level, you run into that problem that everyone rolls at advantage against those spells and has ridiculous high saves anyway.
Yep. And it's weird how every single monster doesn't speak your language all of a sudden.
Strange, right? It's how every higher level monster doesn't know common.
Yeah.
Strange.
I wonder what that is.
That sounds like a interesting and useful change as well. I would be happy if by any chance Withers of the Coast happens to call you tomorrow. Please let me know. I was not involved in that decision, but who knows? What I do know is that I very much enjoyed this conversation, Trekiros. I am very happy you came on here on our channel today and took the time to tell us about your projects, about how you created them, how the process was of making them, and sharing your favorite monsters and anecdotes with us.
Yeah, no problem. It was fun for me too.
Where can people find you on the internet?
So if you like videos, which I know is not everyone, because I've gotten a few comments about, hey, can you give you the videos as a blog post or something? If you like videos, I'm on YouTube. Just look up Trekiros on YouTube and you should find me. If you don't like videos, I also have a website, just trekiros.com. I think it's .com. Yeah, it's .com. Just had to check real quick. Where you can find basically everything I've ever made. And you can subscribe to a newsletter so you can be made aware whenever I release something new.
Perfect. Yes, I also quickly shared those links in the chat of this live stream. So if you want to check out the channel, the YouTube channel, it's in the chat, and also the link to Trekiros' webpage. Thank you very much, Trekiros. We are going to take this little thing offline, maybe still compare some notes on our favorite monsters. Thanks, everyone who dropped by. Thanks for the new subscriptions here on the channel. If you want to see what other kind of stuff we do here on Horde of Tales, you can also find all of the VODs of everything we do on this channel, any kind of other creator talks we had, but also the games and campaigns we run here. You can find those on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com. Please forgive me, /Horde of Tales. And there we have all of our VODs. You can also follow us here on Twitch. And we have below the video also links to our socials and our Discord server. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thanks again, Trekiros. I wish all of you a great rest of your day. And stay safe. Take care. And until next time on Horde of Tales. Bye-bye.
Bye.